If we think about our data protection law, so what's really interesting, again, as I've set out, our island has about 80,000 in terms of population. So we are a very, very small jurisdiction with admittedly limited policy resource to implement large-scale change. I know you're going to hear tomorrow from the team from the UK ICO who advised DCIT on the Data Use and Access Bill. And I remember 5 years ago, between 2020 and 2022, I was working in that team, and I remember the effort that we put into that, providing support to DCIT and then advising them on all of their very, very early ideas. We certainly in my office in the Isle of Man, we wouldn't have the same resource availability nor the same level of legislative policy resource within the government to kind of operate or have such a kind of a complex project running. I'll come to the data protection law specifically in a moment, but in terms of other examples of laws that I'm aware of that borrow very, very heavily from the UK, and we have the FOI Act that my office is also responsible for regulating. That's based heavily on the Scottish Act. And we've also got other laws going through that are not yet public, but again, very, very similar based on UK laws. We also have, really interestingly, the concept of permissive extent. So primary UK legislation does not ordinarily apply in the Isle of Man, and Crown dependencies as well, the others being Jersey and Guernsey. But permissive extent, this is a clause in legislation that means that the government can extend parts or whole of UK legislation when chosen to in the Isle of Man via an order in council. And I know that there's sometimes that particular lever is used. Thinking then about the GDPR when that was introduced back in 2018, given what I've set out there around the context of very, very small context and very, very small pool of people supporting legislative reform in the Isle of Man. There was a need to work very, very quickly from what I understand, and this really, really long predates my time in the island. But there's a need to work quickly and also to maintain adequacy. As Ian set out at the beginning, we have adequacy with Europe, but we also now have it with the UK as well. When I first arrived in the Isle of Man in September last year, I was really confused. When I was sort of being given my, say, initiation into the office or induction into the office, I said, okay, can you just send me a copy of your law? And I was sent all these different links to all of these different documents. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm a cultural theorist by my academic training. And the reason for my confusion is because of the two-tier system in the Isle of Man. And this two-tier system is basically a Data Protection Act, which is largely modelled on the UK's 2018 Data Protection Act. But that act basically is an enabling framework. So the GDPR provisions are applied through the GDPR and LED implementing regulations. So there's an enabling power within the act that allows the island to adopt EU instruments. And as I've said, the GDPR and LED on the law enforcement side were modelled, initially on the GDPR and then the UK Data Protection Act as well.
So what you're saying, although the Isle of Man is not in the EU,
yep,
the law you were working with is really very compatible with the
It is. It's essentially the same. I'll come on to derogations in a moment because we do differ slightly. The last thing I'll mention on this slide is that my position as Information Commissioner, we're named in the FOI Act 2015, which, as I've said, is very, very similar in content and scope to the Scotland Act. And the Supervisory Authority, obviously, we're named in what we call the applied GDPR. My role is appointed by, very similar to John Edwards in the UK, so appointed by and accountable to the Council of Ministers, so essentially that small part of Tynwald. We also have, interestingly, an appeals process that goes through the Data Protection Tribunal, and it is in the public domain, but I don't know how much is in the public domain at the moment. We have our very first enforcement notice appeal going through the tribunal in the Isle of Man, so that will give us some new case law, essentially, which will be interesting for the first time.